The man in the gray suit almost didn't see her. He was already reaching for the door handle of his black car. The kind of car that makes people look twice and pretend they weren't looking when the girl stepped in front of him. Not aggressively, not with attitude. She just stopped where he was going. She was maybe 24, 25. Slim, natural hair pulled back tight. She had on a logistics company jacket, the kind warehouses give their floor supervisors, and she was holding a paper bag from the sandwich place on the corner. Lunch. She'd clearly just bought her lunch, and she was looking at the old woman on the bench like she was looking at someone she recognized. She wasn't. She'd never seen that woman before in her life, but Sergeant Nora Ellison, because that's who she was, even if nobody at that intersection knew it yet, had spent 4 years reading people in places where reading people wrong got you killed. And what she saw in that old woman's eyes wasn't confusion exactly. It was departure, the kind of quiet, slow leaving that happens when a person's mind has decided this world is too loud and has started to look for a door out. Nora had seen it once before. In her grandmother's face, 3 weeks before the diagnosis. She set her lunch on the bench beside the woman and sat down. The man in the gray suit, whose name was Theodore Ashworth, and who was the founder and CEO of Ashworth Capital, and whose time was, by his own accounting, worth approximately $1,200 a minute, stood at his car door and watched this happen. He got in the car. The old woman's name was Margaret Osei. She was 79. She had 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and a name tag from a senior living facility on Delancey that she'd peeled halfway off because she didn't like how it felt on her cardigan. She didn't know where she was. She knew she'd wanted coffee. She remembered that. She'd woken up early and thought, I want to go somewhere and get a real cup of coffee, not the thin stuff they make in the dining room. And she'd put on her good cardigan and she'd gone. But then the bus had been different than she remembered and the street didn't look right. And now she was on a bench and the city was very loud, and she couldn't find the thread of it, couldn't find the thought that would lead her back to where she needed to be. And then someone sat down beside her, not hovering, not with that particular kind of loud concern that made Margaret feel like a problem to be solved. Just sat, the way you sit next to a person you know. That coffee or tea? Nora asked her. She was looking at the paper cup in the woman's hands. Margaret looked down at it. I think it's tea. Where'd you get it? I'm not sure. A pause. I think I just had it. Nora nodded. She didn't push. She'd been around enough people in crisis. Real crisis, not the performed kind, to know that pushing makes the walls go up. She reached into her paper bag and took out half her sandwich and set it between them on the bench. You hungry? Margaret looked at the sandwich, then at Nora. I shouldn't take your lunch. I eat too fast anyway. My old sergeant used to say I ate like I was afraid someone was going to steal it. Margaret almost smiled. Were they? Sometimes, yeah. They sat there for a moment. Just 2 people on a bench. The city moved around them. I think I need to go back, Margaret said finally, quietly, like she was admitting something. Back where? Home. Where I live now. She said it carefully, the way people say things they've had to get used to. It's on Delancey. Nora knew the building. She'd driven past it 100 times. It was maybe 14 blocks away. Walkable if you knew where you were going, a labyrinth if you didn't. She pulled out her phone and called the facility's main line. She'd looked it up the second she sat down and told them, calmly, that she believed one of their residents was with her and gave the cross streets. Then she stayed. That's the part people don't always do. They make the call and they step back like their job is done. Nora stayed on that bench for 40 minutes until a van from the facility arrived, and a staff member she'd spoken with, a young man named Theo, helped Margaret to her feet and thanked Nora 3 times. She have family? Nora asked. A son. He's been notified. Nora nodded. She picked up her paper bag, which now held half a sandwich less than it had before, and she went back to work. She didn't think about it again, or she tried not to. That's not how it went. 3 days later, Nora got a call from a number she didn't know. She let it go to voicemail, the way she let most things go, because she was elbow deep in a shift scheduling conflict at the warehouse, and her phone had been ringing since 7 a.m. The voicemail was from a man named Gerald Dunmore. He said he was Margaret Osie's son. He said he was a real estate attorney. He said, and Nora had to play this part twice to make sure she'd heard it right, that he had concerns about what had happened on that bench and that he would appreciate the opportunity to speak with her. Concerns. She called back. Gerald Dunmore was a particular kind of polished, the voice of a man who had learned, over a long career, how to be pleasant on the surface and precise underneath. He asked her, pleasantly, how she'd come to be sitting with his mother. He asked her what she'd given her to eat. He asked whether she'd had any prior contact with Margaret. Nora answered his questions, all of them, straight. Then she asked one of her own, "Is your mother okay?" There was a brief silence. "She's being evaluated." Evaluated for what? That's a family matter. Another pause. "Mrs. Ellison, I want to be direct with you. My mother is a woman of some means. Her estate is significant, and given the circumstances under which you approached her." "I didn't approach her. I sat next to her. I'm sure you understand why we want to be thorough." Nora was quiet for a moment. In the military, she had learned to be quiet when she wanted to say something she couldn't take back. She employed that training now. "I understand," she said, "that your mother was alone on a bench 14 blocks from home and didn't know where she was, and I sat next to her and made sure she got back safe. That's all that happened." "Of course," he said, pleasantly. He did not sound like he believed her. What happened next took 2 weeks, and Nora would not have known about most of it, if not for a woman named Paulette Grimes. Paulette worked at the facility. She'd been there 11 years. She was the kind of person institutions run on, the ones who know every resident by name and preference, and quietly hold the whole place together, while administrators rotate in and out above them. She and Nora had exchanged numbers when Nora called that day, and she texted Nora on a Thursday evening with 3 words. "You should know." What Nora should know, it turned out, was this. Gerald Dunmore had contacted the facility's director to express concern about the staff member who had allowed his mother to leave unsupervised. He had spoken with the senior director of operations, a man who cared very much about liability, and suggested that the incident reflected poor oversight. He had also, separately, begun a conversation with his mother's doctors about whether her current living situation was appropriate and whether a more controlled environment might be warranted. Margaret had cried when she heard that. Paulette had been there. She'd seen it. And Gerald Dunmore had, additionally, indicated to the facility's legal department that he intended to look into the woman who had sat with his mother on that bench. He had resources, real ones. He'd hired a private investigator, apparently. He wanted to know who Nora Ellison was. Nora found this out and sat with it for a long time. Then she called her old unit chaplain, because he was the person she called when she was trying to decide whether to be angry. "He's protecting his mother," the chaplain said. "He's protecting the estate," Nora said. A pause. "Those things can look the same to a certain kind of man." Theodore Ashworth's involvement started because of a parking space. Specifically, Ashworth Capital's building was 3 blocks from where Nora had sat with Margaret that morning. His building, his company, his car that had been parked outside when she'd made the call to the facility, which meant the call had passed through a network he owned, which meant, and this is where it started to get strange, that his compliance team had flagged it. This is not as sinister as it sounds. Ashworth Capital had a whole division dedicated to monitoring signals of potential liability. It was standard practice in their industry, and a call from an unknown woman to a senior care facility, placed from a location directly outside their building, using language that included the words resident and Delancey. It had triggered a low-level flag. Ashworth himself never would have seen it, except that Gerald Dunmore was a client. not a major one, not a personal one. A legacy client from a deal his firm had structured 12 years ago, before Theodore Ashworth had become the kind of man who only dealt personally with nine-figure accounts. But when Gerald Dunmore's name came up in connection with the flag, someone on his team brought it to his attention. And Theodore Ashworth, whose instinct in business and in life was always to know more than the other person in the room, had a brief conversation with Gerald Dunmore in which he learned about Nora. He did not have an opinion about her immediately. He had questions. That was how his mind worked. He asked his team to look into her. Nora Ellison's file, if you could call it that, was not what Gerald Dunmore had been hoping for. It was not what Theodore Ashworth had expected either. She had served 6 years in the Army, including 2 tours in the 75th Ranger Regiment, which, for context, does not take people who cannot demonstrate exceptional discipline, judgment, and control under extreme stress. She'd left with an honorable discharge and a commendation she'd never mentioned to anyone. She'd spent 2 years working private security before pivoting, improbably, to logistics management, because she said she was tired of watching over things and wanted to build something. She had no record, no complaints, no civil suits, nothing. The investigator Gerald had hired found her credit history, her work history, her lease on an apartment in the Bronx, and a parking ticket from 2021. He found a church she attended intermittently. He found a community garden where she volunteered on Saturdays. He found nothing, because there was nothing. Gerald Dunmore received this information and did not change course. Some men, when they discover they were wrong about a person, revise. Other men look harder. Gerald looked harder. He asked his attorney to draft a formal letter. It suggested, not quite directly, that Nora Ellison had targeted his mother for financial purposes. It referenced the sandwich. It used the word predatory. Nora received this letter on a Tuesday. She read it once. Then she put it on her kitchen counter and went to her community garden and turned soil for 2 hours. When she came back, she called a woman named Commander Adele Forsyth, who was her old CO and now worked in veterans advocacy, and she read her the letter. Forsyth was quiet for a long moment. "You want me to help you, or do you want me to get angry with you?" she asked. "Can you do both?" "I'll make some calls," Forsyth said. Theodore Ashworth read the file again on a Wednesday morning, in his car, on the way into the office. His driver was one of those perfect professionals who made themselves invisible. Theodore read. He had a feeling. He did not always trust his feelings, but he had learned, over 30 years, to at least listen to them. And the feeling he had, reading Nora Ellison's history, was that something was wrong. Not with her. With the situation. He called Gerald Dunmore. "I've looked at this," he said. "Tell me what you actually want." There was a pause. Gerald Dunmore had a particular talent for pausing before he answered questions that should have been simple. "I want to ensure that my mother is protected, from the woman who sat with her on a bench, from people who may seek to take advantage of her vulnerability." Gerald. Theodore Ashworth had a voice that could close a room. He had used it in boardrooms and courtrooms, and once in a parking garage in 2009 when he'd talked a man out of something very bad, and he used it now. "I need you to be straight with me. I don't have time for the other version." Another pause. Longer. "She told her doctors," Gerald said finally, "that the woman reminded her of someone, that she trusted her. My mother doesn't trust easily. She hasn't since my father died." A breath. "Her estate is $42 million, Theodore. I have 3 siblings. I need to know." There it was. Not protection. Fear. The particular fear of a person who has watched someone they love become vulnerable, and cannot tell anymore where love ends and self-interest begins. Theodore Ashworth understood this. He also understood that it didn't make the letter acceptable. "Pull the letter," he said. Silence. "Gerald, pull the letter, or I pull the account." The letter was retracted 4 days later. Nora received a second communication, formal, careful, brief. indicating that the prior correspondence had been sent in error and should be disregarded. She read it. She set it next to the first one on her kitchen counter. Then she went to work. She might have left it there. She was, by nature and by training, a person who preferred resolution to escalation. She had enough going on. Her warehouse crew had 3 open positions. Her car needed new brakes. She was trying to sleep more than 5 hours a night, which was harder than it sounded. She might have left it alone. Except that Paulette texted her again. They're moving her. Decision made Thursday. Gerald signed the transfer papers. More controlled environment. She doesn't want to go. Nora sat with her phone for a long time. Then she put on her jacket and went to see Margaret. The facility on Delancey had a visiting policy that required registration in advance, but Nora had registered the previous week, on a hunch. She signed in at the front desk. Paulette met her in the hallway with the particular expression of a person who has been hoping you would show up. Margaret was in the common room by the window. She was watching birds at a feeder. She looked smaller than Nora remembered, though it had only been a few weeks. "You came back," Margaret said, when Nora sat across from her. "I said I would." She hadn't, actually, but Margaret smiled like she remembered it that way, and Nora let her. They talked for 40 minutes, about the birds, about Margaret's late husband, whose name was Samuel and who had been a jazz musician, about Nora's grandmother, who had also liked tea over coffee and had strong opinions about the right way to make rice, about the neighborhood as it used to be and the neighborhood as it was now. Then Margaret said quietly, without looking away from the birds, "They're going to move me." "I heard that. Gerald says it's better. More supervision." A pause. "He means well. He's always meant well. He just—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "He has a hard time knowing the difference between taking care of someone and being in charge of them." Nora was quiet. "My doctor," Margaret said, "the one I actually trust. Her name is Dr. Rincon. She said I don't need to be moved. She said what I need is consistency and familiar surroundings." A pause. "Gerald hasn't spoken to Dr. Rincon. Has Dr. Rincon documented her recommendation?" Margaret looked at Nora for a long moment. "You sound like a soldier." "I was one." "Then you know how this works. The person with the paperwork wins. The person with the right paperwork," Nora said. Commander Forsyth knew a veterans' legal aid organization in Manhattan that did pro bono work on elder care cases when there was a veterans connection. Margaret's husband, Samuel, had served in Korea. That was the connection. It was thin. Forsyth made it work. The legal aid attorney's name was Kofi Asante. He was 31, precise, and had the kind of quiet competence that shows up early in people who have had to work twice as hard for the same room. He reviewed the case in 48 hours. Dr. Rincon's recommendation was documented. The transfer papers Gerald had signed had not gone through the facility's full review process. They'd been expedited by the operations director, who was, it turned out, nervous about Gerald Unmore's earlier liability comments, and had decided that accelerating his wishes was the safest path for the facility. This was, Kofi explained to Nora, not how it was supposed to work. Margaret Osei had rights. The right to a full care review. The right to have her primary physician's recommendation formally considered. The right, this was the one that mattered most, to voice her own preference. She had not been asked. Nobody had asked her. Theodore Ashworth received a letter of his own on a Monday morning. Not a legal threat. Just information from Kofi Asante's organization, laying out the care review that had been bypassed, the documentation that had been skipped, and the formal request that the transfer be paused pending proper process. It was copied to Gerald Dunmore, to the facilities board, and to Dr. Rincon. Theodore Ashworth read it at his desk, not in his car, because he'd had his driver take the day off. He had a particular habit. When he was wrong about something, he sat with it. He didn't move quickly into the next thing. He considered it the way you'd consider a physical weight. The actual heaviness of it, what it cost. He'd pulled the letter. That had been right. But he had also, for 2 weeks, given Gerald Dunmore the benefit of the doubt that he hadn't extended to Nora Ellison. And he knew, sitting there with the document in his hands, that this was because Gerald Dunmore wore a suit and had an account with his firm and spoke the language of the rooms Theodore Ashworth moved through. And Nora Ellison had been a woman in a warehouse jacket on a bench. He had seen what he expected to see. He called his assistant and told her to hold his morning. He found Nora at the warehouse. She was in the parking lot, reviewing a truck manifest on a clipboard, and she looked up when his car pulled in without recognition, just assessment. The particular calm of a person who has been in situations that required them to know immediately whether something was a threat. He was not a threat. He parked. He got out. Miss Ellison, he said. Yes, I'm Theodore Ashworth. I believe you know my firm was involved in. I know who you are, she said. Not cold. Just clear. He had prepared a version of what he wanted to say, a calibrated version, the way he always prepared. He looked at her and decided it was wrong for the moment. I made an assumption about you, he said. An unfair one. I want to apologize for that. She looked at him for a moment. The clipboard was still in her hand. Okay, she said. That's it? What else do you want me to say? He almost laughed. He hadn't almost laughed in a meeting, or whatever this was, in a long time. I want to make it right if there's a way to do that. The care review is happening, she said. The lawyer has it handled. I know. I've asked Gerald to attend the review in person and to bring his own counsel to hear Dr. Rinken's recommendation directly, not filtered through an operations director. Nora was quiet for a moment. He agreed to that? He will. She looked at him steadily. Why? Theodore Ashworth had been asked this question before. Why did you do the right thing? Why now? And he had given various versions of an answer. Today he told the truth. Because I was standing right there, he said. The morning you sat down next to her. I was 20 feet away, and I got in my car. He paused. I've been thinking about that. Nora looked at him for a long time. She's doing okay, she said finally, in case you wanted to know. She talked about her husband for almost an hour on Sunday. She remembers the music. Theodore Ashworth nodded. Something in his expression shifted, not performed, not managed, just moved. Thank you, he said. The care review happened on a Thursday. Dr. Rinken was present. Margaret was present. Gerald Dunmore was present, with his own attorney, who said nothing because there was nothing to say when the documentation was laid out. Margaret told the panel, clearly and calmly, that she wanted to stay where she was, that she knew the staff, that she trusted her doctor, that she was aware of her limitations and was not asking to be treated as someone without them, only as someone whose preferences mattered. The panel agreed with Dr. Rinken. The transfer did not happen. Gerald Dunmore afterward sat in the hallway for a long time. His attorney said something quiet to him and left, and after a while Gerald walked to the common room where his mother was, and he sat across from her. They stayed there for an hour. Nora, who had waited in the lobby because Paulette had told her the result, learned this from Paulette later. What did they say? Nora asked. I don't know, Paulette said. I didn't listen. Some things aren't mine to hear. Nora drove home in her car with the brakes that still needed replacing, which she'd been saying for 6 weeks, and was finally going to do this weekend, she decided. Actually, this time. She thought about her grandmother, about the way a person's face looks when they're still present but not quite here, still in the world, but already partly past it. She had learned to recognize that look very young, and it had stayed in her, a kind of tuning, a way of seeing. She thought about the sandwich she'd set on a bench on a Tuesday morning, because she'd seen something in an old woman's eyes and hadn't been able to look away. She thought about Theodore Ashworth in a parking lot, saying, I was standing right there. She thought about how easy it is, on any given morning, to get in the car. She stopped at a diner on the way home. It was the kind of place that had been there for 40 years, and would be there for 40 more, the kind that smells like coffee and doesn't ask you why you're sitting alone. She ordered a sandwich, full one this time, and ate it slowly, without hurrying, and watched the city go past the window. There is a version of this story, she thought, where nobody sits down. She was glad she hadn't been that version.